my name is Laura Shoaf. I'm the Program Supervisor for Healthy Families Rappahannock area, and I'm going to be presenting this webinar today. So Rob had asked me a few months ago to talk about some of the techniques that we use at our site to help make some of the data that we're able to pull out of PIMS a little bit more useful for day-to-day program management. So that's what we're going to go through today. And I know that the webinar is scheduled for an hour, but it will not take that long. So we'll have some time at the end for question and answer if there's really specific questions that people want to get into. So the plan for today is that I'm going to talk a little bit about a tickler/ticket report that we've developed that's based off of a PIMS custom query and lets us use Excel functions to calculate due dates and to track completion for all of the tools that are required to be completed for Healthy Families participants. And then I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about conditional formatting in Excel and how we use that as a data visualization tool for our program. So before we get started, I do want to say that I'm sort of assuming a certain level of Excel knowledge for most people, that you know about formatting tables, that you know sort of some basic information about formulas and functions. But as we're going through, if stuff doesn't make sense or if I'm talking about something that you're not familiar with, don't worry about that. We will have some time at the end for questions, and I've also included some resources at the end that can help with getting some more information about Excel and all the things that you can do in Excel. So I'm going to start off with the tickler system. This is something that we developed at our site. We've been using it for I think about 1.5 years now. And we really wanted something that would give us an easy way to track the tools that were due each month for the families that were participating. And we also wanted to be able to see which tools had been completed for the previous month to help us keep track on an ongoing basis to make sure that people were getting done what they were supposed to do. And the key was that it needed to be easy. It needed to be easy to pull the information, and it needed to be easy to read and interpret. So those of you that know PIMS, you know that unfortunately it's a little bit limited when it comes to the tickler idea. There are lots of really great built-in standard reports, but we had a hard time finding reports that would show us exactly what we were looking for. And so we would have to run multiple reports for each staff person, for each family, every month to try to figure out the information and then synthesize it all into some useful format. So what usually happened is I would look like this or like this by the end of the month when I was trying to figure stuff out. So we decided that we were going to take advantage of some of the tools that were available in Excel to use the really rich data that was in PIMS to make it more useful for us. So the way that we did that basically was to create a custom query in PIMS and then export the information into Excel where we could manipulate it a little bit more. So this is what our final reports look like. Excuse me. The one on the left is our tickler, which shows the tools that are coming due for a family for a specific time period. Now this example is for a month, but it could be for any time period that you choose. The form on the right is the ticket, which shows the completion information for whatever time period we're looking at. So it shows us what date the tools were completed and then whether they were completed on time within the time frame that we had set. So as a starting point, we needed to figure out what information we needed out of PIMS. So we decided that we needed some basic identifying information, who the FSW was and who the mom was. We also needed to know the child's date of birth because that is what many of the reports or many of the tools were due based on the child's date of birth. We also needed to know the date of enrollment for some of the MeChif tools or the McV tools, and also for the prenatal depression screening tool, which I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about because that one was a little bit tricky. And we also wanted to build a custom query that was filtered to only look at active participants. So we didn't want to be looking at everybody who'd ever been enrolled in Healthy Families. We only wanted the people that were open right now. So this is what our basic custom query looks like. It's got those identifying pieces of information, and then down in the select criteria option in step 2, it limits to people who are open to services and have not been closed for services. Now, you could also add additional information if it was useful for your site. For example, if you wanted to know the level that a family was on, or if it was helpful to know the child's name, those are things that you could also include in this report. So this is what the query as it comes out of PIMS looks like. We chose to have the current FSW be the first field in the report because that's what PIMS will sort it by when it runs the report. And we wanted to be able to separate out for each FSW. So that is sort of something important to know when you're using the custom queries in PIMS, that whatever is in your first data field is what the report is going to be sorted by. So the next step was to figure out which tools we actually did and when we did them. So this is what that list looks like for our site. These are all of the tools that are done from the time a family enrolls in the program until they graduate, the different screenings and medical tools that are completed. And these may vary for your site depending on your policies and procedures, what your funders require. One thing that I am going to focus on as we go through are just the Healthy Families America tools. We had some different time frames and things for some of the McV tools, so we had to develop a slightly different version of the report for staff who had McV funding. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on Healthy Families America timeframes because it makes it a little bit easier. So the next step was to build our report template. So this is just a basic template in Excel. It lists all of the tools that are due for a family and the time frame at which they're due. And we have it formatted as a table, which makes it easier for sorting and filtering purposes as you go forward. So one thing that I want to point out is that we have all of the tools except for the prenatal PHQ are due based off the baby's date of birth. So for all of these tools, we're looking at the time frame being how many months old the baby is. So for example, medical, the one time frame means that at 1 month that information is to be collected. The exception to that is this prenatal PHQ, depression screening, which has to be collected before the baby is born. So obviously it can't be based off of the baby's due date, or the baby's birth date. So we made a decision to calculate this as the enrollment date plus 1 month. Now, we did that because we know that we tend to enroll people relatively late during the prenatal period, and if we waited too long, we were going to risk missing that tool before the baby was due. And depending on when your site enrolls families, you may choose to set that time frame differently. So if you're enrolling people typically during the first trimester, you could easily wait 3 or 4 months after enrollment in order to set that time frame for the prenatal PHQ, excuse me. So what we needed to do now was to set up some basic formulas to calculate the due dates for each of these tools. So I'm going to take a little time out and talk about formulas and functions in Excel. A formula is the terminology that they use for Excel that is an expression that calculates the value of a cell. So you can see in this example, the formula is A1 plus A2 equals this value here in A3. A function is a predefined formula. So that means that it's something that's already built into Excel. So the function for this would be the sum of A1 through A2. Another formula, or excuse me, another function that we used a lot with this is what's called an e-date. So an e-date calculates a date that is a certain number of months before or after a specified start date. Now the syntax for e-dates is right here. It's e-date, parentheses, start date, comma, the number of months. So this example shows that if you have the e-date formula with your start date of January 6th or 26th and the number of months is 1, it's going to return a result of February 26th. It has this column here for e-date result, and what it's showing you there is that the default way that Excel is going to return this information is in a serial date, which means the number of days after January 1st of 1900. That's just the way that Excel sort of codes dates. But as long as you format the cell to be a date format, it will return it like it shows in column D with the actual date that's, you know, a readable, usable date. You don't actually have to have it in two different columns the way they do here. They just are doing this as an example to show that it's going to default to return it as a serial date. The other thing that we used a lot with this particular tool are what are called if functions. So an if function is something that performs a test, a logical test, and returns one value if the test is true, and another value if the test is false. And again, you can see sort of the syntax here for how you write that function. Now, one caveat that I'm going to give is that I love if functions, and I tend to over-rely on them. So you can do what's called a nested if function that lets you get multiple layers of logical tests. You can do up to 64 of them. That's how many Excel will let you write at a time, 64 layers of the function. But it gets very messy when you do that, and if something changes, you have to go back and change the entire function. So if you're familiar with VLOOKUP, that is really the preferred way to do these sort of multi-step logical tests. But it's not something that I know very well, so I tend to rely on these nested ifs. And you'll see that as we get a little bit further in, that we get some sort of complicated if statements that work. It's just not necessarily the most elegant way to do things. And then the other thing that we used a lot are and statements. So basically this list lets you combine, lets you combine multiple statements. So it looks at if one thing is true and something else is true, then do something else. And then we also use some basic counting functions and some calculations. I'm sorry, my mouse is going all over the place. Here we go. Okay, so back to our tickler template. Like I said, we have these 44 tools that are due for a family during their enrollment time with Healthy Families. And we want to calculate their due dates either based off the baby's date of birth or off the enrollment date for that one prenatal tool. So the formula that we came up with for this is if the tool equals the PHQ-9, then it's going to calculate a date that is the enrollment date plus whatever value is in this time frame column. If it's not the PHQ-9, then it's going to calculate the date as the baby's date of birth plus this enrollment, or plus whatever information is in the time frame column. So once we fill in that formula, you can see that now it's calculating due dates for us. And of course, the due dates look funny, but that's because we haven't entered any information in the date of birth and enrollment date columns yet. That's where we're going to plug in the information that we had pulled out of our PIMS query. So once we have this information plugged in with the baby's date of birth and the enrollment date, you can see that it lists all the due dates for this particular family for their entire period in Healthy Families. And to do this, we just copied and pasted the information over from the PIMS query. Now, we decided that we also wanted to add a column for when tools had been done and when they had been turned in. This is just something to help the staff keep track. We print this off at the beginning of the month and give it to each staff person for their caseload. And so having these columns just helps them sort of keep track of what they've done and what's been turned in for data entry. Now, this could be enough if all you wanted to do was a tickler system that would let you track when tools were due. This form would accomplish that. You could just filter the form right up here by the due date column where it has the little arrow. You could filter it for the specific month that you were looking at. You could filter it by quarter, by year, if that's what you wanted to do. But we also wanted something that would track which tools had been turned in. So we added a couple more columns that would give us an administration date and also would tell us if the tool had been completed on time. So the basic function that we were looking for was we wanted to know if the administration date was within 1 month before or after the due date of the tool. So if the admin date is within either 1 month before, after or 1 month before the due date, it's going to say that it was on time. If the admin date is outside of that time frame, then it's going to say no, that the tool was not completed on time. The problem that we found with this function, this formula, is that it would result in a lot of no's if the tools weren't completed at all. If the admin date was blank, it would still return a value of no because it's not within that 1 month window. So what we had to do is make one of those sort of complicated nesting statements that I was talking about that would look at if the due date was also within the time frame that we were looking at. So I'm going to break this down because it's a little bit of a complicated formula. So what we are asking it to do is look to see, is the due date between the start date that we set up here on the very top, is it between the start date and the end date? So the start date and end date just allow us to set what time frame we're looking at. We can go in and change that to be anything we want. We could look at a 1 month time frame like we are here. We could do it for a fiscal year, for a quarter. You could even do it for a week if that was useful. So what we're asking it to do is to look and see if the value in the due date column is between this start date and end date. And if it is the admin date blank? So it has not been completed, but it's due within this time period. If that's true, then it's going to return a result of incomplete, saying that the tool was due, but it wasn't done. If not, if the admin date is not blank, then it's going to look to see if the admin date is within that 1 month window of the due date. If it is within that window, then it's going to say yes, the tool was done and it was completed on time. If it's not within the 1 month window, it's going to say no, the tool was completed, but it was not completed on time. And then the last thing to sort of close out the statement is we have to say, what if this due date is not between the start date and the end date? So if it's not between the start date and the end date, then it's just going to put a dash to show us that it wasn't actually due during the time period that we're looking at. You could also set it to return a blank value here, but I prefer to do dashes or NAs or something like that so that I know the formula is working, just that there was no value for it to report. So going back to our original statement here, this is the entire formula that goes in this on-time column. Now, the last thing that we wanted to be able to do was run some numbers to show us how well people were doing on turning in their tools on a monthly or quarterly basis. So this is where we're using some of those count functions. So what we have it set to do are to count the total number of tools that were due within that time period, the total number of tools that were completed, so they have either a yes or a no, and then the total number that were completed on time. And it also calculates for us what the completion rate was. So of the tools that were due, how many did they complete, and how many did they complete on time? So these are the formulas that we used for evaluating these. So for tools due, we just asked it to count how many of the items in the due column were counting as yes. So how many of them had a date that was between the start date and the end date. And then it looks at number of tools that were completed based on the on-time column and the number of tools that were completed on time based on the on-time column. We also asked it again to look at the overall completion rate, which is a simple tools completed divided by tools due, or tools completed on time divided by tools due. And it gives us a percentage of how well they're doing with getting their tools done. Uh-oh. And my PowerPoint just crashed. Give me just a second, let's see if we can get this back up. There we go. Okay. So the one thing that we added to make this a little bit more user-friendly are some macros. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with macros, but basically what a macro does is it records a series of things that you do the same way every single time. It makes a recording of that so that it can be done automatically. So either mouse clicks or keystrokes that are done in a consistent way. So examples of places that you might use this are hiding and unhiding columns or adding new rows, setting print areas. If you have special things about the way you save things, any of those can be turned into a macro to save time. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how to do that, but there is, depending on which version of Excel you're using, either in the File ribbon or in the View ribbon, sometimes it's in the Review section, there's a button that says Record a Macro. It will ask you to name your macro and then enter a description. And I would encourage you to be as descriptive as possible, because you will find that once you start using macros, you find lots of other places that you could use them. So it's good to have very detailed descriptions so you know which one this macro is. Once you've named it, you just start recording. So you go through and do whatever it is that you want it to record. And then when you're done, you go back to the macros menu and click the Stop Recording button. And now the macro is there and available for you, and you can just run it whenever you want to follow that series of clicks. So we use it on ours, for example, when we're adding a new client to the report. We have a button that says Add Clients, and it will automatically insert the 44 rows with the name of the tool, the time frame, and the formula for calculating the due date, so that we don't have to copy that information every time. It will automatically insert it for us, and then all we have to do is enter the name and ID number and date of birth and enrollment date. And when you create a macro, you can make a button to put on the spreadsheet, but it won't show up when you print. So on ours, the buttons are up here in the right-hand corner, but they don't actually show when you print. So just to show you again, this is what the final tools look like. So this was the tickler that was due for January for one of our staff persons. And it shows all of the tools that she had due for the families on her caseload that month. And we can also show her what she had done in December and who still had some tools outstanding that she needed to make sure to catch up. Okay, so now that we've covered the tickling information, we're going to move on and switch gears and talk a little bit about data visualization. So data visualization is a fancy way to say, to talk about making data more useful by making it visual in context. So it helps people identify patterns or trends. And it's something that can be very useful because most people absorb information visually. So data visualization is something that most of us use on a daily basis, whether it's charts or graphs. This is a great example of someone who's keeping track of what kind of books they read. And so it's this very simple little chart where they color in the wedges based on how many books they've read in each category. Or it can be incredibly complex, like this histomap of evolution over the last 10,000 million years. So the degree of detail and complexity is really up to you. It depends on what it is that you're trying to do. One of the things that we have found very helpful at our site is using conditional formatting within Excel to color code information. So conditional formatting is something that allows you to format a cell or a range of cells depending on the value within that cell or the value of a formula to calculate something. So for example, on our tickler, or on our ticket, our completed one, you may have noticed that some of the cells were red or orange or yellow. And we use conditional formatting for that. So we have it set up to do a conditional format that if the tool was not completed on time, it automatically turns that cell orange. Or if the tool was missed for the month, then it turns it red. We also use conditional formatting to help keep track of percentages in terms of home visit rates. This is our monthly home visit log. So we have conditional formatting set up to change color depending on what the home visit completion rate was for the staff member that month. So we have set goals at our site that we want to be achieving at least 90% home visit rates. So anything that's 90 or above turns green. Anything that's between 75 and 90, so it's okay, it's meeting the standard, but there's room for improvement, is yellow. And then anything that's below 75% is red, showing that we really need to pay some attention to that. So this is just a very nice visual way for staff to see at a glance how they're doing overall and where they might need to be focusing more attention. We also use it with our assessments with our family resource specialists, not only to track overall tool completion and how they're doing, assessment completion, excuse me, but also to track the time frames for how soon assessments are due. So you can see here we have a column that's assessment due date, and that is set to change colors depending on how soon that assessment is due. So if it's already past due, it's red. If it's due within the next 4 days, then it turns orange. If they've got 10 days, it's yellow. And if it's more than 10 days, it's green. So again, it's a very easy visual way for them to see, okay, these are the ones I really need to concentrate on because they're about to expire, or these are the ones that I have a little bit more time on, so I don't need to worry about them yet. And again, we also use it for our assessment completion up there at the top. So there are lots of places that you might find conditional formatting to be useful, depending on kind of what your priorities are as a program, where you're focusing your attention. You might use it for enrollment timeframes if you're trying to keep track of the number of days between assignment and enrollment, for example. If you have a goal set for how many days you want there to be sort of as a maximum, you could set it to flag those that are getting close to that time frame. You could also use it for caseload numbers or weights, tracking as people are getting closer to their limit, or if people are not as full as you would like them to be. If you're trying to keep caseload numbers up, when people drop below a certain number, you could have it change colors. You could also use it for tracking follow-up on things like ASQs or depression screenings. There's really limitless options when it comes to conditional formatting. So I'm going to ask Rob to unmute it so that we can take some questions if there are any. And while he's doing that, I'm going to point out a couple of resources that we have found very helpful when it comes to using Excel. The ones on the left are just some websites that have really great walkthroughs or tutorials about different features of Excel. I keep going back and forth between muted and unmuted. Okay. So if there's something that you're specifically trying to figure out how to do, these are really great resources for that. On the right-hand side, there are a couple of books that have been really wonderful for us as we're trying to sort of navigate through all the different features that are available in Excel. The first one is called Teach Yourself Visually Complete Excel. The picture that is there is for the Excel 2013 version, but they have it for all the different versions of Excel. And it's really great because it shows screen by screen sort of snapshots of how to do different things in Excel. And then the other one is the Excel Formulas and Functions for Dummies, which is really great for learning about all the formulas within Excel and kind of how you can use them and which are best suited to which uses. So if there are any questions or if people wanted some more information about how we did things, I would love to try to help with that now. It looks like people should be unmuted, but Rob's got a comment here that you can click on the microphone or the telephone icon to unmute yourself. Does anybody have any questions? So there's a question here from Allison about whether we print out a new tickler every month for each participant. We don't print them for each participant. We print one for each family support worker, for each staff person. So let me get back to that screen and I'll show you what it looks like. The way that we have it is that in Excel we have a different tab for each FSW, and then all of their clients are listed on that same tab. So there might be, 25 families or so listed on a tab, and what we would do is print it for that FSW for that month. So you can't really see it very well on here because I have the name and ID numbers blocked off, but it's showing multiple family members for this staff person that all have tools due in December. So I hope that that makes sense. You could also do something similar to this and just have a ticket. I don't know if all of your staff do this, but ours have like a working folder that they keep for each family that is where they keep sort of the tools that they have due for that month. So you could also do something similar to this by family and have it at the front of that working folder for them to keep track of when they've done the tools for their families. Does that make sense, Allison?
So this is Allison. So if I understand this right, you like run the tickler from PIMS and then export it to this. Is that how you do that?
Yeah, so what we were doing originally was running the custom query out of PIMS every month to sort of repopulate the tickler. And we were also running, I don't go into this a lot in here, but we were also running a second custom query to look at all the tools that had been completed so that we could keep track of what was being done. So we would go in and run, you know how you can do participant activities. So we would do participant activities for ASQs, for all the ASQs that were done in January, for example. We found that that was actually more complicated than just entering the information directly into the spreadsheet itself, pulling it out of PIMS, because you would have to do it, multiple times for each different tool. So what we do now is we use PIMS data to populate this Excel spreadsheet, but then we maintain the spreadsheet sort of in parallel with PIMS. So it is a little bit of duplicate data entry, but we found that that was easier than trying to recreate it out of PIMS on a monthly basis.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I see that Lisa has a question about if the presentation is going to be available afterwards. It is up on the PIMS website, which Rob can provide a link for how to access that. Oh, and there he did. Are there any other questions? Rob, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's good. I sent a link to the webpage. There is the PowerPoint and the Excel sample ticket on that page. This is the first time we've recorded the webinar, so I'm going to convert the format and post that online. That should be up later today. Really appreciate you presenting this, and I hope that, not hope, I have some control over that. I would like to have this kind of capability built into PIMS someday.
We would love that too. I'm sure I speak for all of us. And Rob mentioned that there's a sample ticket report on the web page. That is actually in Excel so that you can get in and see kind of how the formulas and stuff are in there. So it's not something that you'd probably be able to just start using because you'd have to make sure that the time frames and stuff were set correctly for your program, but you should be able to sort of play with it a little bit. All right. Well, unless there are any other questions, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you all so much for attending today, and I hope this is useful.
Thanks, Laura. This was great.
Thank you. I hope you survived the ice up there.
Yeah, we got about, I don't know, 10, 12 inches of snow.
Oh my gosh.